The big house stood tall and proud in a quiet street in Lagos, Nigeria. It was surrounded by high gates and beautiful gardens, showing the kind of wealth most people could only dream of. Inside the house, everything was neat and shiny. The workers moved quickly, cleaning, cooking, and making sure everything was perfect for the family who lived there. Madame Chinyere was the owner of the house. She was a rich and powerful woman, feared by many because of her sharp tongue and strong personality. Her son, Ifeanyi, was only 8 years old, but already acted like he owned the world. He was spoiled, rude, and always got his way. Whatever he wanted, he got, and nobody dared to correct him. One afternoon, Nkechi, the housemaid, was in the kitchen. She was young, quiet, and hard-working, always doing her best to please Madame Chinyere. On this day, she was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables and humming softly to herself. The house was unusually quiet, and she enjoyed the calm as she worked. Suddenly, Ifeanyi came running into the kitchen. His shoes made loud sounds on the tiled floor as he stopped beside her. Nkechi glanced at him briefly, offering a polite smile. "What do you want, Ifeanyi?" she asked, expecting him to demand a snack or complain about something. But before she could react, Ifeanyi did something shocking. He reached out and grabbed her inappropriately. Nkechi froze in place, her eyes wide with surprise. She could not believe what had just happened. "Ife!" she shouted, stepping back quickly. "What are you doing?" Ifeanyi looked at her with a smirk on his face, his small shoulders shrugging like it was no big deal. "Mama says I can do anything I want." "You can't stop me," he said, his voice full of arrogance. Nkechi's hands trembled as she tried to stay calm. She looked down at the boy, anger and sadness mixing in her heart. "No, Ifeanyi, that is wrong. You must never do that again," she said, her voice firm but gentle. But Ifeanyi didn't care. He laughed and said, "You're just a maid. You don't tell me what to do." Nkechi couldn't believe what she was hearing. For years, she had seen Ifeanyi misbehave, shouting at workers, breaking things, and even insulting adults. But this was different. This was serious. She bent down and held his arm firmly, looking into his eyes. "Listen to me, Ifeanyi. You must learn respect. What you did is very bad, and you cannot act like this again," she said. At that moment, Ifeanyi started screaming at the top of his lungs. His voice was so loud that it echoed through the house. Nkechi let go of him, shocked by his reaction. He ran out of the kitchen, still screaming, and she stood there frozen in fear. She knew trouble was coming. Later that evening, Madame Chinyere came home. As soon as she stepped into the living room, Ifeanyi ran to her crying and pointing toward the kitchen. "Mama, Nkechi hit me. She was mean to me," he wailed, tears running down his cheeks. Chinyere's face darkened immediately. She called for Nkechi in a loud, angry voice. Nkechi walked into the room slowly, her heart pounding. She stood in front of Madame Chinyere, her head slightly bowed. "What is this nonsense I'm hearing?" Chinyere said, her voice cold and sharp. "You touched my son. You, a common maid." "Madam, I didn't hurt him," Nkechi said quickly, her voice trembling. He did something wrong, and I had to correct him. "Shut up," Chinyere snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare try to explain yourself. My son can do whatever he wants. Do you hear me? You have no right to touch him or tell him what to do." Nkechi's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed silent. Her chest felt tight and her hands shook. She wanted to defend herself, to explain what had happened, but she knew it was useless. That night, Nkechi cried alone in her small room. She felt helpless and trapped. She had no family nearby, no one to support her. If she lost her job, she wouldn't know where to go or what to do. But deep inside, she also felt anger. Why was Ifeanyi allowed to behave this way? Why did nobody stop him? The next day, things went on as if nothing had happened. Madame Chinyere acted as if everything was normal, and Ifeanyi was back to his usual mischief. But Nkechi noticed something. His behavior was getting worse. He started teasing the female workers in the house, saying rude things and laughing when they got upset. At a family gathering a few weeks later, Ifeanyi tried something similar with one of his young cousins. This time, the girl screamed loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Nkechi, who had been watching from a distance, felt her heart sink. The adults gathered quickly, looking confused and worried. Ifeanyi's mother was the first to speak, brushing off the incident. "He's just a boy," she said with a smile. "Boys will be boys." But Nkechi could see the fear in the young girl's eyes. She knew that this could not continue. She had to do something, even if it meant risking everything. Nkechi spent the next few days in deep thought. She knew that speaking up could cost her job, but she could no longer stay silent. Ifeanyi's behavior was growing worse, and the damage he was causing was clear. The young cousin, Ada, now avoided family gatherings altogether, and other relatives whispered uneasily about Ifeanyi's actions behind Chinyere's back. Still, no one dared to challenge Madame Chinyere directly. One evening, as Nkechi finished her chores, she noticed Ifeanyi sitting in the living room with his tablet, completely engrossed in a video game. His smug smile and carefree attitude fueled her frustration. She thought about the journal she had been keeping, careful notes of every incident involving Ifeanyi. It wasn't much, but it was something. If she could gather more proof, maybe, just maybe, someone would take her seriously. The next opportunity came sooner than she expected. A week later, another family gathering was held at the mansion. It was a lively event, with laughter, music, and children running around the garden. Nkechi stayed in the background, serving drinks and clearing plates as the adults chatted, but she kept her eyes on Ifeanyi. She noticed him lingering near the children's play area, watching the younger girls with an unsettling look. Alarm bells went off in her mind. She decided to follow him discreetly, pretending to be tidying up as she kept him within sight. It wasn't long before she saw him approach his 10-year-old cousin, Amaka, who was playing with her doll. Ifeanyi leaned in close, whispering something to her that made her visibly uncomfortable. Amaka tried to move away, but Ifeanyi grabbed her wrist. Before things could escalate, Nkechi stepped forward. "Ifeanyi, leave her alone," she said, her voice firm but calm. The boy turned to her, his face twisting into an angry scowl. "Mind your business," he snapped. But Nkechi didn't back down. "This is my business. You shouldn't treat people like that," she said, her eyes locking with his. Amaka quickly slipped away, running to find her mother. Nkechi felt a wave of relief, but knew this moment wouldn't go unnoticed. Sure enough, a few minutes later, Chinyere stormed into the garden, her face flushed with anger. "Nkechi," she called, her voice sharp and commanding. Everyone turned to look as Nkechi approached, her heart pounding. "Yes, madam," Nkechi said, keeping her tone steady. "What did you do to my son this time?" Chinyere demanded. "Amaka says you were shouting at him again." "I was not shouting, madam," Nkechi replied. "I was stopping him from behaving badly toward Amaka. He was grabbing her wrist and making her uncomfortable." Chinyere scoffed loudly, waving her hand dismissively. "Uncomfortable? He's just a boy. Boys are curious, it's normal. You're blowing things out of proportion as always." The other adults exchanged uneasy glances, but nobody said a word. Amaka's mother looked down at the floor, biting her lip nervously. Nkechi's anger boiled over. "Madam, with all due respect, this is not normal. What Ifeanyi is doing is wrong, and if nobody stops him, he will only get worse." Chinyere's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you accusing my son of something? Who are you to question how I raise him? You're just a maid." The insult stung, but Nkechi stood her ground. "I may be a maid, madam, but I know right from wrong. Ifeanyi needs to be taught how to respect others. He is hurting people, and it's not fair to let him continue." Chinyere's face darkened with rage. "That's enough. If you say one more word, you'll be out of this house by morning." Nkechi opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a quiet voice spoke up. "She's right, Chinyere." The crowd turned to see Amaka's mother stepping forward, her face pale but determined. "My daughter has told me things I didn't want to believe at first, but now I see it's true. Ifeanyi's behavior is not just curiosity, it's harmful." Chinyere's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. "Are you trying to say my son is a bad child? How dare you?" "I'm saying he needs help," Amaka's mother replied softly. "And maybe some discipline too." Ignoring this will not make it go away. For the first time, a ripple of agreement spread through the group. A few other relatives nodded quietly, their expressions hesitant but supportive. Cinieri looked around, her confidence shaken. But instead of addressing the concerns, she turned on Nkechi. "You've poisoned their minds against my son. This is your fault." Nkechi felt a lump in her throat, but refused to back down. "I'm only telling the truth, madam. Someone had to." The argument ended abruptly when Cinieri stormed off, dragging Ifeanyi with her. But the tension lingered in the air, and Nkechi knew this was far from over. In the days that followed, the house grew colder. Cinieri barely spoke to Nkechi, and Ifeanyi became even more difficult, throwing tantrums and breaking things whenever he didn't get his way. The other staff avoided her, fearing they would be caught in the middle of the conflict. But Nkechi held onto her journal, now filled with detailed accounts of Ifeanyi's actions and the events at the family gathering. She didn't know what she would do next, but she was determined to protect the other children, even if it meant putting everything on the line. The tension in Madame Cinieri's household grew thicker with each passing day. Nkechi continued her work as usual, but she could feel the hostility in the air. Madame Cinieri barely acknowledged her presence, and Ifeanyi seemed to grow bolder in his mischief, knowing his mother would shield him. One evening, while Nkechi was cleaning the living room, she heard the sound of hushed voices from the corridor. Curious, she paused her work and listened carefully. It was two of the other maids, whispering about the incident at the family gathering. "Did you see how Madame dragged Ifeanyi away that day? She was furious," one said. "Yes, but I heard Amaka's mother told Madame's sister about what happened," the other replied. "They say the family is worried now. Ifeanyi's behavior is getting too much." Nkechi's ears perked up. Could it be true? Were others in the family finally starting to see the problem? This gave her a glimmer of hope, but she knew Cinieri would not go down without a fight. The next day, the household was unusually busy. Cinieri had announced that a special dinner would be held and important guests were coming. Nkechi worked tirelessly with the other staff to prepare the house, but her mind was elsewhere. She decided that she needed to act soon. Keeping silent any longer would only make things worse. That evening, as the guests arrived, Nkechi observed them from the kitchen. Among them were Cinieri's sister, Auntie Ifunanya, and her husband, Uncle Obinna. They were well respected in the family and known for their no-nonsense attitude. Nkechi decided they might be her only chance to bring attention to the issue. During the dinner, the atmosphere was lively. The adults laughed and chatted while the children played in the garden. Nkechi served the guests quietly, her eyes darting between Ifeanyi and the other children. She noticed him whispering to one of the younger girls, a timid 5-year-old named Kamsi. Fear gripped Nkechi's heart as she watched him lead Kamsi toward a quiet corner of the garden. He followed them outside. She glanced around the room, hoping someone else would notice, but the adults were too engrossed in their conversations. Nkechi knew she couldn't wait. She placed the tray she was holding on a nearby table and quickly, when she reached the corner of the garden, her worst fears were confirmed. Ifeanyi was standing too close to Kamsi, trying to grab her hand. The little girl looked uncomfortable and scared, her eyes darting around as if searching for help. "Ifeanyi," Nkechi called out sharply, her voice cutting through the evening air. The boy turned around, his face filled with annoyance. "What do you want now?" he sneered. "You leave her alone this instant," Nkechi said, walking toward them. "You can't tell me what to do," Ifeanyi shot back, crossing his arms defiantly. Nkechi ignored his words and crouched down to Kamsi's level. "Are you okay, my dear?" she asked softly. The little girl nodded but clung to Nkechi's arm, clearly shaken. Just as Nkechi was about to lead Kamsi back to the house, a voice rang out behind her. "What is going on here?" It was Cinieri, her face a mask of fury as she marched toward them. Behind her were Auntie Ifunanya and Uncle Obinna, who had followed her outside after noticing her sudden exit. Nkechi straightened up, holding Kamsi's hand tightly. "Madam, I found Ifeanyi here with Kamsi. He was making her uncomfortable," she explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Chinyere's eyes narrowed as she looked at her son. Ifeanyi, is this true? The boy, sensing trouble, quickly put on his best innocent face. I didn't do anything. She's lying. Chinyere turned back to Nkechi, her anger boiling over. You're accusing my son again? Do you have any proof? Or is this just another one of your stories? Before Nkechi could respond, Auntie Ifunanya stepped forward. Chinyere, let's not dismiss this so quickly. This isn't the first time we've heard complaints about Ifeanyi's behavior. Chinyere's face turned red with embarrassment. Are you siding with a maid over my son? How dare you? Uncle Obina, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Chinyere, this isn't about sides. It's about protecting the children. If there's a problem, we need to address it before it gets worse. The argument drew the attention of the other guests, who came outside to see what was happening. The tension was palpable as Chinyere struggled to maintain her composure. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. If you all think my son is such a problem, then maybe it's time we had a family meeting to settle this once and for all. The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Nkechi felt a mix of relief and anxiety. A meeting could be her chance to finally expose the truth, but it also meant putting herself directly in Chinyere's line of fire. As the guests returned to the house, Nkechi stayed behind, watching the stars flicker in the night sky. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't backing down, not this time. The family meeting was scheduled for the following weekend. As the day approached, Nkechi prepared herself mentally, reviewing her journal and gathering the courage to speak up. The question was, would the family believe her, or would Chinyere's influence silence her once again? The week leading to the family meeting was tense for Nkechi. Madame Chinyere's anger loomed over the household like a dark cloud. Ifeanyi, emboldened by his mother's unwavering defense, was more insufferable than ever, going out of his way to provoke Nkechi whenever he could. Despite this, she remained steadfast, knowing the upcoming meeting might be her only chance to shed light on the situation. When Saturday arrived, the family gathered in the mansion's large dining hall. Chinyere had summoned her siblings, in-laws, and a few elders of the family, hoping to rally their support and crush the allegations against her son. Nkechi stood quietly in the corner, clutching her journal, her palms damp with sweat. The meeting began with formal pleasantries, but the tension was palpable. Chinyere opened the discussion, her voice sharp and commanding. I called this meeting because some people have been spreading lies about my son, she began, shooting a pointed look at Nkechi. Ifeanyi is just a child. Children make mistakes, but that does not mean he is a bad boy. This is all a misunderstanding. Some family members nodded, but others exchanged uneasy glances. Auntie Ifunanya spoke up. Chinyere, we're not here to accuse anyone unfairly. But Ifeanyi's behavior has been causing concern for a while now. We need to address it before things get worse. Chinyere glared at her sister. What behavior? Ifeanyi is no different from any other boy his age. Nkechi felt her heart racing. This was her moment. Summoning all her courage, she stepped forward. Madam, with all due respect, I believe Ifeanyi's behavior has gone beyond what is normal for a child. Chinyere's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't interrupt. Nkechi opened her journal and began recounting incidents she had witnessed. Every inappropriate comment, every act of disrespect, every time he had made someone feel unsafe. The room fell silent as she spoke. Some family members looked shocked, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When she finished, Nkechi took a deep breath and said, I'm not saying this to harm Ifeanyi. I care about this family, and I care about him. But he needs to learn boundaries before it's too late. Chinyere shot to her feet. Enough of this nonsense. This maid has overstepped her place for the last time. If she hates my son so much, she can leave my house right now. Before Nkechi could respond, Uncle Obina stood up, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Chinyere, sit down, he said firmly. We are not here to protect your pride. We are here to protect our children. The room fell silent again. Obina turned to Nkechi. Thank you for speaking up. It takes courage to say these things, especially when you know the consequences. He then addressed the rest of the family. We've been ignoring this problem for too long. Ifeanyi is a child, yes, but his actions have been harming others. We can't continue to excuse his behavior just because he's young or because Chinyere doesn't want to admit there's an issue. Auntie Ifunanya nodded in agreement. This isn't just about Ifeanyi, it's about all the children in this family. They deserve to feel safe and respected. Chinyere looked around the room, her face a mix of anger and humiliation. For the first time, she seemed to realize she was outnumbered. I only wanted to protect my son, she said quietly, her voice trembling. He's all I have. If you truly want to protect him, Chinyere, you'll help him learn right from wrong, Obina replied gently. Discipline isn't punishment, it's love. After a long silence, Chinyere sighed and sat down. What do we do now? She asked, her voice softer than before. The family discussed solutions late into the evening. It was decided that Ifeanyi would see a child psychologist to address his behavior. Chinyere reluctantly agreed to implement stricter rules at home, and the family pledged to hold each other accountable for raising respectful, well-behaved children. As for Nkechi, she was commended for her bravery. Some family members even apologized for doubting her. Chinyere, though still hurt and defensive, thanked Nkechi privately. I may not agree with how you handled this, but you did it for the right reasons, she admitted grudgingly. Life in the household slowly began to change. Ifeanyi struggled with the new rules at first, but gradually began to show improvement under the guidance of the psychologist. Chinyere, though still proud and stubborn, made efforts to be more attentive to the concerns of others. Nkechi stayed on with the family, earning the respect and trust of those around her. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt a sense of hope. For Ifeanyi, for the family, and for herself. And as she looked out the kitchen window one evening, watching Ifeanyi play more gently with his cousins, she allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Change was slow, but it was happening.